I thought he was just some lunatic trying to fake his own death, until I opened the coffin 10 days later and saw the photo of my house. He said he wanted to be forgotten, but he left me too many instructions, too many specific details, and now I feel like I was chosen. If you also think he never really wanted to die, comment, it wasn't the end. He came in at dusk, when the light over the hills begins to surrender to the kind of blue that feels colder than night. I was still in the back lot, putting away the tools from an early burial, when I heard the gravel crunch under boots that didn't belong to anyone I knew. This was a small town, the kind where everyone came in pairs, came in slow or didn't come at all. But he came alone, like he'd just walked out of fog that hadn't touched anyone else. Tall, pale under the hood, and moving like his body hurt in places he'd learned to ignore. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't shake my hand. He just said, "I need a favor," and pulled a thick envelope from his coat. The cash inside smelled of basement rot and lavender, like it had been stored beside secrets. "No family," he added. "No ID, no prints, no name. You don't need one." I told him that wasn't how it worked. There were protocols, paperwork. He didn't flinch. Just handed me another envelope, sealed in red wax with a symbol I didn't recognize. A circle broken in 4 with a slash through the middle. "Open this only if something goes wrong," he said, and there was a finality in his voice that made my tongue dry. "This is my last request. I'm already dead, in the ways that matter." I tried to laugh it off, asked him if he meant metaphorically. He didn't answer, just stepped back and nodded toward the truck I hadn't even noticed he'd parked at the edge of the lot. A hearse. Old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in black and white photos, with silver trim and heavy velvet curtains drawn shut. He walked me to the back and opened it like he was revealing an altar. Inside was a coffin, dark wood, polished but worn, as though it had seen dirt before. No labels, no manufacturer's mark, just a single iron ring where the cross should have been. He placed a hand on the lid. "It's weighted," he said. "They'll think I'm in it, but I will be. Just later." That's when I realized what he meant. He wanted to be buried, alive. I started shaking my head, slow at first, then faster when I saw that he was serious. Told him I wasn't that kind of man, wasn't into sick games, wasn't desperate for money. He waited until I ran out of excuses. Then he handed me a final document, notarized, signed, witnessed, stating that he was of sound mind, that he requested burial with full awareness of consequence, and that I would not be held liable for any outcome. I read it 3 times. Every word was precise, clinical, like it had been drawn up by a lawyer who believed in ghosts. I should have walked away. I knew that, but I didn't. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. Not pleading, not threatening, just certain, like he'd already seen me say yes in some other version of this moment. And then there was the money, enough to patch the roof, fix the truck, pay off the last of my father's debts. Enough to make the silence in my house less heavy. I asked him why he wanted this. Why now? Why here? He didn't blink. Because I've been above too long. Because there are things I promised not to tell. Because there's no safer place to vanish than in plain dirt. He didn't smile, didn't cry, just waited. I told him to come back after midnight, that I needed time to think. He nodded, turned, and walked away like he'd just laid a stone on someone's grave, maybe his own. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me, untouched, the wax seal catching moonlight like a blood clot frozen in glass. I made coffee I didn't drink, thought about calling someone, the sheriff, the coroner, anyone. But what would I say? A man wants to disappear and chose my shovel? I waited until the clock struck 1. Then I walked out into the cold and met him where he said he'd be, leaning against the hearse, smoking a clove cigarette like it was the last thing tethering him to breath. I asked him if he was sure. He said he'd been sure for years. I asked if he was ready. He said he was born ready to disappear. So I dug, 6 feet by 3, straight and solemn like I'd done 100 times before. He watched the whole time, silent, as if measuring my effort against the weight of whatever he was burying in me by asking. Then, without ceremony, he climbed into the coffin, didn't flinch when it creaked, didn't panic when the lid lowered, just whispered, "Thank you," through the crack before I sealed it shut. I buried him. No one saw. No one came. The dirt went down easy, like it had been waiting for him. When it was done, I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the fresh soil like it might blink. I told myself it was over, that I'd done something wrong, but done it clean, that the envelope was insurance, not invitation, that the man was mad, and the mad don't return. But I was wrong, because the grave didn't settle, because the dirt never crusted, because 10 days later, when I opened the coffin again, something else was waiting inside, and it wasn't him. He returned just after sundown, exactly as promised, dressed the same as before, long black coat, dusted with road salt, boots scuffed from travel, eyes unreadable and calm in a way that didn't feel human anymore. I had prepared everything by then. The hole was dug, deeper than usual, the earth stacked neatly beside it, compact and solemn like a freshly made bed. I had made sure no one would be around. Thursdays were always dead quiet, and I told the others I'd lock up alone. I even left the front gate unlatched, so he could walk right in without drawing attention. The coffin sat beside the grave like a closed question. I couldn't stop staring at it. The lid had no hinge, no markings, just that iron ring in the center. Not decorative, not symbolic, just functional. I'd tapped on it earlier, out of nervous habit, and the sound it gave back was too hollow, too distant, like there was more than just space inside. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded to me like I was some attendant to a ritual I didn't understand. He ran his hand slowly across the lid of the coffin, as if checking it for warmth or permission. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded cloth, which he laid over the top. Black velvet, with something sewn into it in faint red thread. At a glance, it looked like a spiral or a maze, but when I blinked, it seemed to change. Split into mirrors, then back into lines. I stopped trying to make sense of it. "No witnesses," he said. "No prayer. Just soil." I asked him again if he was sure. I needed to hear it one more time. I needed to hear the certainty in his voice, outweigh the dread building in my ribs. He nodded, then added, "It only works if I go down silent. No breath, no scream, no fight, just sleep." Then he opened the coffin. Inside it was lined with black cloth, hand-stitched, uneven, as if done in haste or desperation. There were no cushions, no padding, just a single small pillow at the head, and a worn photograph taped to the underside of the lid. I caught a glimpse before he covered it with his hand. It was a photo of him, or someone like him, standing in front of what looked like a field of charred trees. I asked what it meant. He said, "Memory." Then he took off his coat and shoes, folded them with a precision that felt more like ritual than habit, and climbed into the box like he was laying down in his own story. His breath was calm, his eyes closed. He crossed his hands over his chest, then paused, opened them again, and placed one palm flat against the lid before it shut. I froze. "That's so I remember how to knock," he whispered, then closed his eyes for the last time. I closed the lid. It didn't creak. It just settled into place with a soft thud, like it had been waiting for him to return. I stood there with my hands on the wood, listening. At first there was nothing. Then, just before I grabbed the shovel, I heard it. The faintest rustle, like cloth moving against wood. Then 3 slow taps. Not frantic, not scared, just present. I didn't answer. I began to bury him. The dirt sounded loud in the quiet. Each shovelful felt heavier than the last, not from weight, but from meaning. I kept expecting something to stop me. The voice of reason, a scream from the box, a gust of wind to scatter the dust. But there was nothing. Just the grave and my breath and the sound of soil swallowing silence. When I was done, I tamped it down carefully, gently, like tucking in a child. I didn't mark the grave. No cross, no stone, no name. Just dirt. Just quiet. I stood over it for longer than I should have, thinking about what I'd just done. Not as a crime, not even as a ritual, but as a kind of agreement. A trust too deep for paper. I looked up and saw the sky was starless. The clouds had pulled over everything like a shroud. The wind shifted, and for a second I thought I heard something. Not a voice, but a low hum, like breath against glass. I shook it off, went home. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from guilt, not yet. Just from the weight of stillness. My house felt too quiet, the walls too thin. The envelope he gave me sat on the table, unopened. Its seal looked darker in the lamplight, almost redder. I stared at it for hours. Something about it felt warm, like it remembered his hands. I didn't touch it. I told myself it was insurance, just in case. But deep down, I think I knew. It was a mirror, not of him, of me. The next morning, the grave looked undisturbed. The soil had settled flat, like it had always been there. I checked the grounds 3 times before I left for lunch. No disturbances, no footprints. But the cemetery dogs wouldn't go near that corner. They'd walk in circles, whining, ears back, and one even pissed himself near the gate. That was the first sign, the first whisper of what was coming. I should have listened then. I should have walked away, but I didn't, because 10 days later, I opened that grave again, and I was the one who found what he left behind. It sat on my desk for 10 days, unopened, untouched, but not forgotten. The envelope had weight to it, not in grams, but in gravity. It was cream-colored, thick like parchment, sealed with a wax circle that bore no emblem, just a single fingerprint. I told myself I wouldn't open it, not unless something went wrong. That was the instruction. And by all surface appearances, nothing had gone wrong. The grave stayed sealed. No reports, no movement. But that weight, on my chest, in my throat, in my sleep, kept pressing. The kind of pressure that doesn't bruise skin, but memory. I'd wake up certain I'd heard something scratching in the floorboards, or whispering in the pipes, or shifting on the roof tiles like bare feet circling above me. But every morning, everything was still. That made it worse. Because then, I'd sit down at my kitchen table, and there it would be. Exactly where I left it. Facing me. The envelope. Like it had spent the night watching. On the 10th day, I gave in. I didn't make a ceremony of it. I didn't light a candle or pour a drink or even take a breath to mark the moment. I just broke the seal. It made a sound like paper exhaling. Inside were two things, a photo and a letter. I looked at the photo first. It was my house, taken from the street, in the same gray dusk I knew so well, with my porch light just flickering to life. The curtains were drawn, but not tightly. Behind them, a shape, a silhouette. A man standing in my living room. I could make out the outline of his shoulders, the slump of the left one, just like mine, and the shape of the coat he wore. My coat. The old canvas one with the torn pocket and the stitched cuff. The one I hadn't worn in over a week. The one I left in the closet. I stood up so fast my chair fell. I ran to the window and yanked the curtain open. Empty street. Same gray dusk. Same flickering porch light. I checked the closet. The coat was there, but the pocket wasn't torn. The cuff wasn't stitched. The fabric was new, untouched, clean. It wasn't the same coat. It was the same design, the same shape, but not the one I remembered. I went back to the letter. My hands shook when I opened it. Not from fear exactly, but from something deeper. Recognition. Before I even read a word, I knew the handwriting. It was mine. Down to the slant of the T's, the tight curve of the S's, the shallow dips in the Y's. But it wasn't a copy. It wasn't someone imitating me. It was me, writing things I never remembered writing. The letter wasn't long, a few paragraphs, but every word sat heavy in my gut like it had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. If you're reading this, it began, then the ritual has already begun. It explained nothing. Not the man, not the request, not the reason for his vanishing act. What it gave me instead was instruction, a list. You will feel watched. You are. Don't speak to the shape in the mirror. Don't respond to the knock if it happens at 3:33. If you smell cedar, do not breathe in. If your voice echoes indoors, leave immediately. If you find your photograph anywhere it shouldn't be, burn it, but not with fire from your house. If you hear your name whispered by someone who sounds like you, lock your windows, even if it's daylight. Do not dig up the grave again, not until the final sign. You'll know it when the dogs return. It ended with a signature. My name. My full name, written exactly as I do when I sign legal documents. Long, neat, slanted right. Below it, a date. Not the date I opened the envelope. The date I buried the man. The exact hour, to the minute. I sat down slowly, clutching the letter like a confession. My heart wasn't racing. It had slowed. I felt cold. Not frightened, but aligned. Like puzzle pieces snapping into place. I began remembering things I hadn't lived. Shadows I never cast. Dreams I never dreamt but now seemed familiar. Like reruns of a show I'd watched once as a child. That night, I couldn't stay at the house. I drove to the cemetery and sat in my truck until dawn. The grave looked the same. Flat. Undisturbed. But the air around it buzzed like static. I could hear nothing, but I could feel sound. Like low tones just outside the range of hearing. I walked to the grave with the letter in my pocket. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask questions. I just stood there until the sun rose. Something inside me shifted that morning. The weight of choice. I had been part of something now. Not just a burial, but a transaction. And I couldn't help but wonder, what had he given up? And what had I received? When I returned home later that day, My porch smelled faintly of cedar, and the answering machine was blinking. I hadn't used it in years. I hadn't even known it was plugged in, but that red light blinked slow. One new message. Just one. I didn't press play. Not yet. I wasn't ready. Because in that moment, I finally believed the letter. Every word. Every warning. I believed it was mine. And I believed something had shifted. Something had taken a step out of the dark. Not with violence. Not with haste. But with certainty. Like it had always been mine to meet. I didn't open the message that night, though the blinking light stayed with me long after I turned away from it. I lay in bed with the hum of silence louder than anything my ears could catch. And every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was lying too still, like I was imitating rest instead of inhabiting it. The body can play tricks when the mind is stretched thin. But this went deeper. In those 10 days, something in the world began behaving differently, as if my axis had shifted slightly, and the air hadn't yet caught up. It began with small things. A misplaced shovel here, a set of keys there. Tools I always hung in the same order now off by just enough to make me doubt myself. The cemetery has always been quiet at night. A respectful stillness broken only by wind or the occasional owl. But during that week, there were no natural sounds at all. No crickets, no birds, no nocturnal rustlings from the trees. The wind blew cold, but silent, like it didn't want to disturb what lay beneath. And that patch of ground, the one where I'd buried him, never seemed to stay the same. I would rake it flat, come back in the morning and find it just slightly uneven. Not dug up, not disturbed in any traditional sense, but off, like the soil had breathed differently. The grass there didn't wilt, but it didn't grow either. The color shifted subtly, refusing to match the surrounding green. At night, a soft flickering light danced near it. Never bright, never direct, just a presence at the edge of vision, like a candle burning behind frosted glass. At first, I assumed it was headlights from the road or a trick of the moon, but it persisted on nights with no traffic and no moon. The animals knew something. Cats, usually curious enough to perch on gravestones or wind between legs, refused to enter that quadrant of the cemetery. A fox I'd seen more than once on its nightly patrol now stopped at the edge of the gravel path and turned around, staring back at me like it pitied me for going forward. One night, I saw a dog I didn't recognize sitting near the front gate. A mutt, black with streaks of gray, too far to make out its eyes, but it never moved. It just watched. When I approached, it was gone. I heard no footsteps, just empty air where it had been. On the fourth night, I woke up at 3:33 a.m., not from a dream, but from a sensation. Something had touched my wrist. Not hard, not cold, just fingers. I turned the light on instantly. Nothing. But my watch was gone. It had been beside me, on the nightstand. I tore the sheets apart. Nothing. In the morning, I found it in the cemetery shed, hanging on a nail, ticking backward. That was the first time I considered opening the letter, the one he'd given me. But I waited, because I had made a deal with myself. Not until something went wrong. I tried returning to routine, raking, repairing, logging entries in the burial book. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was finally cracking after all the years alone with the dead. But then I found my boots moved. I always lined them against the wall in a certain way. Left toe slightly forward. Laces tucked. That morning, the laces were tied. Both boots stood neatly, ready to step into. I hadn't tied them. I hadn't worn them in 3 days. I left the house and didn't return until sunset. My skin itched under my clothes like I'd worn someone else's coat too long. On the 7th night, the motion sensor lights in the cemetery turned on. They're old, barely functional, and rarely triggered. But at 2:12 a.m. they all blinked alive, one by one, from the far edge of the grounds toward my shack, like someone was walking the perimeter. I stepped outside with a flashlight. No footsteps. Just the light by his grave, flickering again, and the faint smell of cedar. It wasn't strong, just enough to raise a memory. My grandfather's old drawer where he kept his shaving kit, a place no one else ever touched. That scent followed me back to my bed. When I closed the door, I heard my own floorboard creak. The 8th day was worse. I found the burial logbook with fresh writing, my handwriting. The entry for his burial had been edited, new details added. Buried by request. No name. Payment received. Witnessed by self. I never wrote witnessed by self. That phrase chilled me more than anything else so far. I didn't understand it. Was it a mistake? Was I recording something I couldn't remember doing? Or was something else writing it in my hand? That afternoon, the photograph reappeared. The same photo of my house that was inside the envelope, but now it had changed. The silhouette was closer to the window, clearer. The outline of the hand was raised, touching the glass. I turned the photo over. One sentence had been added in faint pencil. Not long now. On the 9th night, I dreamed I was underground. No coffin, just dirt. Compact around me, but not crushing, like it was holding me in place. I wasn't afraid. I was waiting. I opened my mouth to scream and dirt poured in, but I didn't choke. I swallowed it. It tasted like ash and cedar. I woke up with my mouth dry and my hands clenched as if I'd been digging in my sleep. My fingernails were filled with soil. The 10th day broke cold and windless. I arrived early at the cemetery and walked the perimeter. Every gate was locked. Every lock was intact. But the path to his grave had fresh footprints. Mine. Down to the way my heel dragged slightly on the left. I walked to the grave and the earth had changed. Still intact, still filled, but no longer still. The top layer pulsed, like breath under cloth. That was when I returned home, opened the envelope, read the letter. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about one man vanishing. This was about something old, something practiced, and something that had chosen me for a reason I was only beginning to understand. 10 days without rest, and it was only just beginning. I returned before sunset, though I told myself I wouldn't. I kept repeating in my head that it was just a grave, just earth and wood and stone. That whatever I had seen, the flickering lights, the shifting soil, the strange notes, the edits in my own handwriting, could be explained by exhaustion or something deeper unraveling in my mind. But I went back anyway, shovel in hand, steps heavier than I'd ever felt in my life. The wind wasn't moving through the trees. The air was so still it felt like I'd stepped into a photograph of the cemetery, instead of the place itself, frozen mid-breath. I stopped a few feet from the grave. Something was different. Not loud or overt, just enough to disturb the pattern. The dirt had settled lower than before, as though the coffin had collapsed, or something had shifted beneath it. But I knew it hadn't, because the cross I'd planted was no longer upright. It leaned slightly toward the east, just enough to cast its shadow crooked across the other plots. And at its base, buried beneath the first layer of gravel, was something that should not have been there. A small torn scrap of cloth. Familiar. Too familiar. I knelt and brushed it off. A fragment of flannel, blue, gray, and red, from a shirt I used to wear. A shirt I hadn't seen in years. I kept it in a box with old keepsakes, long since buried under other things in my attic. I hadn't worn it since my father died. But the fabric was fresh, not aged or rotting. It smelled like it had just been pulled from the dryer. And as I held it, I saw the corner of something else peeking out from the soil, folded cleanly, wax-sealed with a faded stamp I recognized before I even touched it. My initials. Not just carved, but in my handwriting. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. I stared at it for too long, palms sweating. Then I opened it. Inside was a photograph. Not just my house this time, but me, standing in the kitchen window, unaware, caught mid-turn as if someone had called my name. My expression was unreadable, eyes cast down, but the timestamp printed faintly in the bottom corner chilled me more than anything. It had been taken 3 nights ago, at 2:12 a.m., the exact time the motion lights had gone off across the cemetery. I don't remember being awake at that hour. I don't remember standing by the window. I don't even remember being home. But there I was, caught forever in the grain of cheap photo paper. Below the photo, someone had written in tiny block letters, "Let it breathe." That phrase kept circling in my mind like a drain that never quite emptied. Let it breathe. I stood, holding the envelope, my breath catching in my chest. The grave no longer looked like a resting place. It looked like a warning. I circled the plot once, then twice, scanning for footprints, drag marks, any sign of tampering. But the earth was smooth, save for the subtle indentations that looked more like something shifting from within than anything disturbed from above. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in the caretaker's shack, the small one-room building where I kept records and tools. I locked the door, latched the windows, and sat in the single chair with the envelope clutched in my lap, the photo face downward. I didn't want to see it anymore. I stared at the floorboards until dawn. Around 4 a.m., the walls creaked, a slow, deliberate groan like old joints adjusting, and then the sound stopped. When morning came, I stepped outside and found a trail of dirt leading from the grave to the rear of the chapel. Not a lot, just enough to mark a path. At the end of the trail, beneath the wooden overhang where the mourners usually gathered, was another envelope, this one unsealed. Inside, A single photograph. A coffin, the one I buried, opened, empty. And resting in the center, placed like an offering, was a photo album. My photo album. The one I lost when I moved into my house nearly 10 years ago. I hadn't seen it since. In the photo, the album was open to a picture of me as a boy, 8 or 9, standing next to a man with a blurred face, arms slung around my shoulder. I never had a picture like that. Not one where someone stood that close to me, whose face I couldn't remember or define. But what chilled me more was that behind us, in the photo's background, stood a cemetery gate. This cemetery, same arch, same iron design, but the photo was decades old. That evening, I dug. I told myself it was for confirmation, for sanity, for control. I brought no one with me, no lights, just the shovel, gloves, and the certainty that I couldn't sleep until I knew. The first few feet of earth came up easy, loose, as if someone had disturbed it recently. The deeper I went, the harder the dirt pressed against the shovel, heavier than it should have been. At the 5-foot mark, I hit something soft, not the coffin, fabric. I pulled it up. Another shirt, mine, folded neatly. Beneath that, the coffin lid. I paused. My breath was shaky, palms raw from gripping the handle too tight. I opened it slowly. Inside, no body, just a mattress, clean, white, still warm. Resting atop it, a folded blanket and another photo. This time, a picture of me, sleeping, in my bed. Last night's clothes still on, taken from the corner of the room, angled downward like someone had stood on the dresser. My chest tightened, my vision blurred. The shovel slipped from my hand and hit the side of the coffin with a dull knock. That was when I heard it. Breathing, not mine, below me, faint, measured, calm, not desperate, not even trying to hide. I dropped the lid and began covering the hole. I didn't stop until every trace of the grave was concealed again. I flattened the dirt, returned the cross to its place, and walked back to the shack with shaking knees. That night, I opened my closet to find every photo album I owned stacked in a perfect column. On top, a single note in handwriting identical to mine. "You're almost ready." I didn't sleep. I haven't since. Something was buried 10 days ago. I don't think it was him. I don't think it was me. But I think whatever it was is no longer underground. And whatever's in my house, walking my halls, wearing my flannel, watching me from the mirror, is waiting for me to give up trying to tell the difference. I told myself not to go back. I told myself whatever was buried in that coffin, whatever had left behind the shirts, the pictures, the notes, it wasn't something that should be revisited. But I've learned that the mind doesn't obey warnings when the silence gets too loud. It was 2 nights later when I walked back to the grave, flashlight off, no shovel this time, just the weight of everything I'd seen resting on my shoulders like a second skin. The earth was still flat, no sign of disturbance, but I noticed the grass had started growing faster around that spot. Thicker, darker, like it was being fed something the rest of the cemetery wasn't. I stood there, watching the wind press against the trees without touching me, as if the air itself didn't want to acknowledge what lay beneath. That's when I saw the photo. It hadn't been there before. Resting directly at the foot of the wooden cross, perfectly centered, weighed down with a flat stone as if someone wanted me to find it but not lose it to the wind. I knelt, peeled it from the dirt, and stared at the image. My house again. But this time, the picture wasn't from the street. It was from inside. The angle was from the kitchen doorway, looking into my living room. I could see the back of my head on the couch, slumped as if asleep. But I don't remember falling asleep there. I don't even remember sitting down. The lights in the photo were off, but a faint glow came from the hallway, casting a long shadow over the rug. A tall figure, arms at its sides, watching me. I flipped the photo over. No message this time. Just a faint impression, like someone had pressed their finger into the paper before it dried. I recognized the fingerprint. I don't know how, but I did. It was mine. I took the photo home, locked every door, every window. I even nailed shut the old service hatch in the laundry room, something I hadn't done in years. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, exactly where the photo had shown me, waiting. Around 3 a.m., the silence changed. Not sound, not motion, just the absence of something I hadn't known was there until it left. A kind of pressure, like someone lifting their gaze after staring at the back of your neck too long. I turned on every light, checked every room. No one was there, but something had changed. My closet was open. Inside, the same photograph I had taken from the grave now rested on the shelf, this time in a frame. A note leaned against it. "Return what you borrowed. That phrase clung to the inside of my skull like wet cloth. I didn't take anything. I told myself that, repeated it, whispered it like a prayer. But the moment I said it out loud, something in the house creaked, sharp and sudden, like the crack of old bones. I ran to the attic. I hadn't been there in years. My father's things were still boxed away, sealed tight. But one of them, an old cedar chest, was open. Inside, my childhood photo albums, but rearranged, not in the order I left them. And on top of them, a black and white photograph I had never seen before. A boy, lying in a coffin, eyes open, smiling, wearing my shirt, my face, but younger. And behind the coffin, a man with a shovel, face blurred, hands tucked behind his back like he was waiting for someone to speak. I dropped the photo, backed away, stepped down from the attic and didn't return. The next morning, I burned the photo in the fireplace, watched the edges curl and blacken, but it didn't scream. It didn't even smell like photo paper. It smelled like soil, fresh, wet, as if it had just been dug from the ground. That afternoon I received a call, no number, just static, then a click, then a voice, my voice, whispering, "You're in the wrong house." I smashed the phone, went to the cemetery, poured salt around the grave, poured gasoline. I didn't light it. I just sat there, watched, waited. And that's when I noticed the coffin was above ground. I hadn't dug. I hadn't even touched the earth. But the casket sat cleanly on the surface, no dirt on the lid, just placed there, like a gift returned. My name was etched into the top now. No plaque, no stone, just carved directly into the wood. My first, middle, and last. I opened it, slowly. Inside, no body. But the silk lining was still warm, like it had been used. And resting on the pillow was another photo. Of me, sitting at the cemetery desk, filling out a form I never remembered writing. Behind me in the picture, through the window, stood the man. The one I buried, face still calm, hands folded, watching. I don't remember when I closed the coffin. I don't remember walking back to the shack. But when I got there, the logbook had been updated. My name signed out. No one else had the key. And beneath the signature, someone had written a new entry. Burial successful. Witness pending. I no longer sleep at home. I stay in the caretaker's quarters. Each night, a new photo appears somewhere in the room. Always of me. Sometimes sleeping, sometimes walking. Once, digging, but never looking at the camera. Until last night. The photo was of me, in this very chair, writing, and my eyes were locked directly on the lens. I wasn't alone in the shot. Behind me, a shadow taller than the doorframe. The caption read, "Closer." I don't know what's waiting in that coffin, or why it keeps showing me myself, but I feel something pulling, not from the grave, from within, like I'm being hollowed out one image at a time, and one day soon when I look in the mirror, it won't be me looking back. It'll be the one who paid to vanish, and left a body behind to learn the cost. I kept that photo, not because I wanted to, but because throwing it away didn't feel like an option anymore. Nothing did. The house wasn't mine the way it used to be. It breathed differently now. It had a rhythm, a pulse I couldn't match. I used to know where every creak in the floor came from, every pipe that groaned when the water ran. Now those sounds arrived out of order, like a song I'd once learned by heart being hummed back to me out of tune. I didn't go back to the coffin for a few days. I couldn't, not after seeing that image of myself in the chair, writing, with that shape looming behind me. But I couldn't stay away either. It had become an anchor, the only fixed point in a world that had started unraveling the second I agreed to bury that man. On the 5th day, I found the envelope. I hadn't noticed it before, though part of me suspects it had always been there. I found it not in the grave, not in the chapel, not even in the caretaker's shack, but inside my refrigerator, tucked between a jar of mustard and a bottle of water I don't remember buying. Cream-colored parchment, wax seal already broken, but the flap was still closed. My name was written in cursive across the front. My full name, the one I hadn't used since high school, the one I scratched off forms because I hated the way it sounded, the one only my mother and my brother used. I brought it to the desk and sat down. The lights flickered the moment I pulled out the first sheet. 10 pages, each one numbered. Neat, careful, methodical. It was a guide, a ritual, titled plainly at the top, "Ritual of Withdrawal, Final Draft." The words beneath it were mine. I recognized the style instantly, the narrow spacing, the particular way the lowercase f curled back into itself, even the way I crossed my T's with a slight hook to the left. but I had never written this. Not once. Not in dream, not in trance, not in sleep. I flipped to the last page. A signature waited for me there. My signature. And a date. 10 days ago. The same night I buried him. I started reading. Each step was more unsettling than the last. The ritual required 3 things: voluntary burial, a symbolic item buried alongside the person, and a witness who would unknowingly complete the exchange. It instructed that the participant, the man who paid me, had to remain conscious during the burial, had to keep his eyes open, and had to visualize the person whose life he intended to take. Not steal. Take. As if it were a coat being shrugged off one set of shoulders and pulled onto another. There were warnings, too. If the witness opened the envelope before the 10th day, the transfer would fail. If the coffin were unearthed prematurely, the ritual would delay, but not cancel. If the participant left behind more than one item of symbolic weight, then, and only then, would the withdrawal reverse. I read it twice. Then again. There were annotations in the margins. Phrases only I would write. Don't forget. This matters. Or, he won't notice at first. I felt my stomach turn when I reached the part about how the transfer manifests. At first, it said, the witness may feel only the absence, misplaced objects, loss of time, broken memory. Then the layering begins. Photographs change, voices echo, the reflection grows unfamiliar, and finally the withdrawal. Identity, location, history. One replaces the other. I turned to look at the framed photo on the shelf, the one of me writing with the figure behind me. I remembered the camera that used to sit in my office, the one my wife gave me before she left. It had vanished 3 days ago. I didn't know where I put it, but someone had found it. Someone had been using it. I turned back to the envelope. Tucked into the final page was something that hadn't been there before. A Polaroid. Smaller, older. The colors slightly faded. It was a picture of my old bedroom in the house I grew up in, the bed I shared with my brother. 2 boys in the frame, one asleep, one sitting up, staring directly into the camera. Me and me. Identical down to the scar on the temple we both got when we fell off the swing set at 7. But one of us had eyes open. The other didn't. The back of the photo had a short line, written in the same handwriting. One always wakes up first. I dropped it, backed away from the table. The house groaned again, but slower this time. The way a throat clears before speaking. I felt the walls shift. Not move, but adjust. Like something was inside them, aligning itself to my breathing. I ran to the front door. Locked. The key wasn't where I left it. I rushed to the window. The cemetery was still out there, but the trees had changed. They were closer, taller, pressed up against the edge of the property like they were watching. I checked my phone. Dead. No battery symbol. Just black, like it had never been charged. I don't know how long I sat in the corner of that room staring at the envelope, but eventually the lights came back on, every bulb at once, and on the desk, beside the envelope now closed again, sat a fresh sheet of paper, blank, except for the first line, rewrite your ending. No pen, but the paper smelled like ink. I wanted to scream, to rip it all up, to burn the desk, the letter, the pictures. But part of me knew. I wasn't the one being asked to finish this. I was the one who already had. I just couldn't remember when, or why, or how long ago it really happened. Because the man I buried wasn't running from death. He was running from me. And now, I was the one trapped in the middle, between his name and mine, between the ritual I supposedly wrote and the life I no longer recognized as my own. I don't know what the next step is, but I know this much. Someone's watching, waiting, and the grave isn't empty anymore. I think it's mine. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The air in the house had grown too still, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to either fall or rise. Every noise was too precise, too timed, like a metronome ticking behind the walls, marking each second of a countdown I couldn't see. I sat in the living room, wrapped in an old blanket I didn't remember pulling out, and stared at the landline phone mounted on the wall. I hadn't used it in years. It was the kind of thing that remained out of nostalgia or habit, not purpose. I didn't even know if it still worked. But when it rang, just after midnight, the sound nearly split me open. It wasn't a normal ring. It was lower, slower, as if someone had tampered with the recording speed. It rang twice, then stopped. I didn't move, not until the blinking red light came on beneath the speaker grill, the signal that a voicemail had been left. I waited an hour before pressing play. I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping it would disappear. Maybe I was hoping it wouldn't. The first few seconds were nothing but static, not white noise, but something denser, wetter, like breathing through gauze. Then came the exhale, long, deliberate, too close to the microphone, followed by silence. Then, my voice. But not from any memory I could place. It wasn't a message I had ever recorded. I wasn't greeting anyone. I wasn't saying my name. I was whispering, slowly, carefully. I buried you so I could return. The message ended there. Just that one line. Not a phrase. A confession. The phone clicked off on its own, the light going dark like a shutter closing over my sanity. I replayed it, again and again. Same voice, same words, same pacing. I knew how my voice sounded, even when scared. I knew the tiny hitch in my throat that only came when I was lying. That sound was there. I had meant it. Whenever I recorded it, if I ever had, I meant it. And yet I had no memory of speaking those words. No context. No explanation. Just that haunting sentence like a code only I was meant to understand. My skin crawled. Not from the words, but from the sense that someone was trying to help me remember. That message wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. A breadcrumb left by a version of myself I had no access to anymore. I disconnected the phone from the wall, ripped the cable out with shaking hands and tossed the whole thing into a drawer. But the whisper stayed, echoed in the corners of the house like it had been absorbed into the drywall. I walked outside to get air, but even the air felt wrong, like it wasn't mine to breathe anymore. The stars were too dim. The street lamp across the road flickered with a rhythm that almost mimicked the ticking from inside the house. I looked at the windows across the cemetery fence. There was someone standing in the chapel, silhouetted in the stained glass. Tall, still, watching. I don't remember unlocking the gate, but I found myself inside the cemetery grounds moments later, boots crunching the gravel as I moved past headstones that suddenly seemed unfamiliar. I knew every grave in this yard, every name, every crack in the marble, every family story passed down through whispers or silence. But that night, the markers were blank, not wiped away, blank, as if they had never been carved, as if no one had ever been buried here. I turned around. The chapel door was open, and from inside, I heard the voicemail play again. I buried you so I could return. Clear, loud, this time, with no static, just that phrase, repeating every 10 seconds like a loop. I stepped through the threshold. The chapel had changed. The pews were missing. The altar was replaced with a mirror, a tall, warped thing that seemed to bend in and out like breathing glass. The walls pulsed, not visibly, not in movement, but in sensation. My skin felt it, like the room had a heartbeat. The mirror showed me nothing at first, just the chapel behind me. Then the light flickered, and a figure appeared. My coat, my posture, my eyes. But the mouth moved without sound, and it didn't move with me. I raised a hand. The reflection stayed still. I turned. The mirror did not. I ran. Out into the cemetery. Back to my house. The lights inside were on now. All of them. Even the ones I never used. Even the one in the attic, where no bulb had been screwed in for years. I opened the door. The phone I had thrown into the drawer was back on the wall. Plugged in. Ringing. I stared at it. Let it ring. 7 times. 8. It stopped. Then beeped. Voicemail. I didn't move. Not that night. I waited until sunrise. When light finally came through the windows, it was gray, bleached, as if filtered through something thick and old. I picked up the phone, pressed play, static, then breathing, then the voice again. My voice. You're almost ready. Just one more night. The message ended. I didn't sleep. I watched the walls for signs of breathing. I listened for footsteps I didn't take. And I waited, not for answers, but for the thing that was pretending to be me, to knock, or worse, walk in without needing to, because something had changed. The ritual wasn't just continuing, it was accelerating, and I no longer knew if I had been the one who buried that man, or if I had been the one buried, and now simply playing catch-up to the version of myself that walked out first. I don't remember falling asleep. That's the first thing I realized when I opened my eyes to sunlight I didn't feel. It was morning, or at least the light outside said so, but my body didn't believe it. There was no stiffness in my joints, no hunger, no hint of a night spent in bed or on the couch or anywhere I could name. I simply existed, upright in the chair in my living room, hands folded on my lap like I'd been arranged. The room looked the same but wrong. Not in the dramatic sense, not twisted or disfigured, just cleaner. Like someone had walked through the space and straightened everything to the point of sterilization. The rug was perfectly aligned with the floorboards. The frames on the wall were no longer tilted. The mail on the kitchen counter was stacked, not scattered, with yesterday's envelope on top, even though I hadn't checked the mailbox in 3 days. There were fresh boot prints at the back door, mine maybe, but the boots beside the mat were dry, free of mud, neatly placed heel to heel like a soldier's preparation. My eyes wandered to the clock. 7:47 a.m. Not digital. The old wooden wall clock I kept mostly for the ticking sound I found comforting. It didn't tick anymore. The hands moved, but silently. I stood slowly, half expecting the world to fall sideways when I did, but I was balanced. Too balanced. Like I'd already been awake for hours, despite knowing I hadn't. There was a note on the table, my handwriting again. A single line. Act natural. No context. No date. Just that. I folded it and put it in my pocket without thinking. My mind felt like it was watching itself from a few steps behind. I was in my body, but not alone in it. I walked to the bathroom, looked into the mirror, and for a full 5 seconds, I didn't recognize the man staring back. The eyes were mine, yes, but they were too still, too knowing. They didn't blink when I blinked. When I finally raised my hand to touch my cheek, he smiled. Not mockingly, just slightly, as if to say, "There you are." And then, he blinked too. We were back in sync, but the damage was done. Something had caught up, or passed me. I went outside to clear my head. The air was thick, like breathing through cloth, but the world looked normal. Too normal. A bird landed on the fence post and chirped once, then stopped. Just one note. The neighbors' sprinklers went off at their usual time, painting arcs in the grass. But the water didn't seem to hit the leaves. It passed through them, evaporating before it landed. I crossed the road. Slowly. The gravel felt different beneath my boots. Not softer, just unfamiliar. As though the texture had been replaced. At the corner, across from the cemetery gate, a man stood facing me. He wore my coat. The same tear in the left cuff. The same faded patch on the shoulder where I'd spilled oil last winter. He waved. Friendly. Familiar. He didn't walk closer. Just raised a hand, tilted his head like he'd been expecting me. I didn't wave back. I couldn't. My hand wouldn't move. I blinked. He was still there. I turned away. Walked the long path back to the office at the cemetery, hoping the routine would anchor me. I opened the ledger, the logbook where we documented each burial, each name, each date. There was a new entry. Today's date. My name, written in my handwriting. Time of burial, 12:01 a.m. Location, unmarked. I flipped back through the last few pages, looking for some kind of pattern. But the previous names had started fading. Not erased, just dimming, like pencil left in the sun. My name, however, grew darker with each reread. Bolder. I stepped outside. The shovel leaned against the chapel door, right where I never left it. Clean, newly oiled, prepared. I walked the perimeter of the cemetery. My feet took me without choice, as if retracing steps already taken. Near the western wall, behind the row of dogwood trees, there was a fresh plot. Dug recently. Soil still soft, undisturbed. No marker, no flowers. Just a small folded cloth on the grass. I picked it up. It was my shirt, the one I wore 2 days ago. Pressed, clean, folded perfectly. Beneath it, another note. Same hand. 1 day late. I knelt there for a while. Not crying, not afraid, just hollow. I ran a hand through the dirt, felt its temperature. Too warm. I pressed my palm flat against the center of the grave and closed my eyes. Beneath the soil, I swear I felt a heartbeat. Not frantic, just steady, like someone waiting to be let out, or let in. I didn't dig, not yet. I stood and returned to the chapel. The mirror was there again, even though it had never been installed. A tall, framed slab of black glass, leaning against the pulpit where no one preached anymore. I looked into it. This time, the reflection blinked first. I reached forward and touched the glass. It was warm. The surface rippled, only once. And I swear, only for an instant, the man looking back at me wore my face, but not my expression. He wasn't afraid. He was patient, watching, counting. And somewhere deep in the chapel, a clock started ticking. For the first time in days, I heard the sound, and I understood. I hadn't woken up. I was still in it, whatever it was. And the version of me outside, walking in my coat, waving at strangers, signing logbooks in my name. He was just getting started. I returned to the cemetery the next evening, not because I had something to do there, but because I no longer knew where else I belonged. The roads had become unfamiliar. Even the turns I'd driven 100 times felt subtly misaligned, as though someone had shifted the entire map of the town by a few inches while I slept, or while I'd been absent from the world in a way that couldn't be measured by hours. The cemetery gates were open when I arrived. They're never left open after sundown, but the lock wasn't broken. The chain had simply been placed neatly beside the post, like whoever opened it intended to come back soon. I stepped inside, and the wind that brushed against my face didn't feel like it came from the hills or the weather, but from breath. It moved like an exhale from something waiting. The chapel lights were on. I never left them on, not even for services, but they glowed soft and yellow, as if someone had dimmed them carefully to simulate the illusion of life within. I pushed open the door, expecting cold, musty air, but instead, I was met with warmth, not heat, but presence. The kind that fills a space when someone has just left or is about to arrive. On the pulpit sat the logbook, open to a new page. The name written was mine. Again, this time in red ink. The date was the same as today's. The time, 8:44 p.m., the exact minute I was reading it. I looked up, and the mirror, the tall black pane that hadn't been part of the chapel just days ago, had now been hung cleanly above the altar. It reflected the room perfectly. The pews, the windows, me, but not me. The figure in the glass stood just slightly straighter than I did. His shirt wasn't wrinkled. His hands weren't trembling. And when I turned my head, his stayed forward, staring, watching. I stepped backward and out the door. I needed fresh air, but the night outside had thickened. Not darkened, not in the usual way, but folded inward, like the sky was leaning too close to the ground. I walked past the northern plots, past the low stone wall, until I reached the section we'd recently cleared for expansion. That's when I saw it. A new grave. Not listed in the registry. Freshly turned earth, perfectly rectangular. No marker. But sitting upright at the head was something that shouldn't have been there. My coat. The one that had gone missing a week ago. Folded, dry, unstained, but visibly worn at the seams, with the missing button still absent on the left cuff. Beside it, a pair of gloves I hadn't seen since last winter, and propped neatly against the cross, not nailed, not tied, was a photograph. Me, standing at the gate of the cemetery, taken from inside. The image was recent. My face still bore the slight redness from that shaving cut I'd made 3 mornings ago. I turned the photo over. No writing, no signature, just a faint fingerprint pressed into the corner. Too smudged to be conclusive, but shaped like mine. I felt the air shift again, and in the distance, near the tree line, a figure stood. The coat was mine. The posture was mine. The man didn't move, not even as the wind pulled the trees sideways. I called out, but he didn't answer. Just raised one hand, palm out, like someone giving a farewell, or a warning. I stepped toward him, but the ground beneath me didn't cooperate. It felt sticky, heavy, like walking through syrup. The figure faded into the woods before I reached the halfway point. I turned back toward the grave, and that's when I noticed something else. The shovel. My shovel. Leaning against the pile of unused soil, its handle worn smooth by years of work. It hadn't been there when I arrived. Someone had placed it gently in position while my back was turned. I picked it up, still warm. I looked down at the grave, at the soft soil waiting. The space was the right size, the right depth. Everything measured, prepared, exact. Like a reservation made long ago finally being honored. I couldn't bring myself to step in. Not yet. Instead, I walked the perimeter again, hoping distance would change what I'd seen. But when I returned to the chapel, the lights were off. The mirror gone. The logbook closed. The candles that lined the wall had been lit, faint flames that flickered without breeze. And from the back corner of the room, I heard footsteps. Mine. Not echoes. Not memory. Footsteps that matched mine exactly in rhythm and weight. I turned. No one. But I knew he was here. Not hiding. Just waiting for me to stop pretending this place was still mine. Outside again, I looked toward the eastern gate, and there he stood. Not in silhouette, in detail. My face, my hands, my walk, but improved. Slightly sharper eyes, steadier breath. He watched me like someone who'd finished their turn at the game and was ready to pass the piece. I approached, slowly. And as I did, he nodded once, then stepped aside. Behind him, another grave. This one shallow, half-filled. I looked down. There was a body. My body. Not dead, not alive. Just resting, breathing, waiting for someone to finish the job. He handed me the shovel. I didn't take it. He smiled. The same smile I saw in the mirror. That knowing, patient smile. The one that says, "You're catching up." Then he turned, walked down the path toward town, and vanished into the trees. I stood there for a long time, long enough for the air to cool, for the mist to rise, for the last of the moonlight to stretch across the stones. Then I turned back to the grave, picked up the shovel, and began to dig again. Not deeper, but smoother. Preparing, not for burial, not for death, but for whatever came next. Because I knew now, I wasn't the only one who had been watching, and I was never the one who had truly remained.